The next item on the working agenda on page 2 is Hicks versus Uible. This is a disclaimer complaint as well out of Claremont County. It too is a little bit different and interesting than what we normally deal with. Mr. Hicks is available online there. Counsel for Mr. Uible is present here. Chris is going to step aside and let him use his computer, I think, so that he would be able to address the commission as well. The issue here is that I guess you'd say a false disclaimer was placed on the literature because materials were circulated that reflected that they were the responsibility of the Claremont County Republican Party. But after a lengthy investigation by the Claremont County Sheriff, filed with this commission that that wasn't the party that was circulating these materials, but was circulated by a particular candidate, Mr. Uible. The investigation by the sheriff's office was conducted that confirmed that. There are also matters pending, I believe, in Claremont County Common Police Court as it relates to this, or that will be pending as it relates to this. We're really only dealing with the disclaimer issue. Certainly, we can hear from Mr. Hicks. We can hear from counsel from Mr. Uible as well. You can see my recommendation is to find the violation and impose a fine of $100. But Mr. Chair, if you want to hear from the parties to the matter, we have the ability to do so, or you can proceed forward.
I think since the parties are here, let's hear from them.
Okay. Mr. Hicks, it would be your basis to go first. You're the complainant. You're muted, Mr. Hicks. We can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Richter, I think you did a nice summary, but effectively what happened here is Mr. Uible represented that he had the authority of the Republican Party to a printer to print materials that were slate cards that were to help him. A backstory on the whole thing is one of the reasons why I'm going to stop you
there, Mr. Hicks, real quickly, just because I should have sworn you in to make a statement.
Okay.
And I didn't do so. I apologize. So, Mr. Hicks, we're telling you the whole truth and nothing but the truth to help you out.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, please make your statement. I apologize for interrupting you.
No worries. No worries. So I apologize for being on mute before. So what happened in this is Mr. Uible represented himself to a printer as having the authority of the Republican Party to send out materials that were favorable to him. The reason why, one of the backstory's motivations for that is that he was on probation at the time for a prior criminal conviction relating to tampering with a petition, where he had been, so he was getting hammered on that issue because he was on probation while running for the Senate. So he was then charged, as Mr. Richter mentioned, after an investigation with falsification and obstruction. And those charges just recently were dismissed only because the matter got moved to a special prosecutor versus an in-house cooking thing in Claremont County. And I believe that it'll be imminent that felony charges may be filed against Mr. Uible at some point. I think I heard that, I know your authority of what you do as a commission is limited in scope and doesn't involve all the things I just brought. But when I just heard $200 as a fine for a disclaimer, and I just heard Mr. Richter say $100 fine for something like this, I think whatever the maximum penalty you can have is what should be being considered here. And I think it would be outrageous otherwise when there's criminal activity involved in falsified mailers that are taking place. So I don't know if I take questions, but that is effectively my statement. But again, I think that it would be irresponsible on part of the commission not to basically throw the book at this one when it involves criminal matters that are pending or will shortly be pending.
Are there any questions of Mr. Hicks from commission members?
Phil, try that again. You were garbled.
Oh, sorry. I kind of leaned away. I was just saying, are there any questions for Mr. Hicks? If not, you can hear Council, Mr. Uible, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to address this board. Mr. Uible would have been here personally present. He had sent some correspondence. He has had a scheduled trip to Idaho, and he is in Idaho and wanted to make sure the board, the committee knew how important this was for him. And I am here to represent Mr. Uible. My name is Aaron Moss. And what I completely disagree with Mr. Hicks' representation is that this was an unauthorized act. Yeah, in part of your correspondence, Mr. Greg Simpson, the chairman of the Claremont County Republican Party, submitted in anticipation of this hearing a letter to this body. And Mr. Uible was represented by Mr. Hicks as not authorized. Our endorsement policy in Claremont County Republican Party allows an endorsed candidate, which Mr. Uible was, an endorsed candidate from Claremont County Republican Party, to the resources of the party. The slate card that is the subject of Mr. Hicks representing that he has somehow fraudulently used it is incorrect. The slate card that Mr. Uible had contracted for the reproduction of the slate card for him to send out was an endorsed slate card that was true in form as it was created by the Claremont County Republican Party. The Claremont County Republican Party, after they go through an endorsement meeting, creates a sample ballot. I refer to as a slate card sample ballot. The act here is that Mr. Uible reproduced the slate card in anticipation of mailing it, and it would have came from the Claremont County Republican Party, even though Mr. Uible was the person bearing the cost of the reproduction and distribution of an otherwise approved slate card. So my question is, when 3517 does include the print, distribution, reproduction, distribution, all must have the who paid for disclaimer. This particular slate card did have the paid for by Claremont County Republican Party. Chairman Greg Simpson, I believe that was also provided by Mr. Hicks in your materials. So the materials did have a disclaimer, but it was Mr. Uible who was actually sending it out. The other matters that are sensational and inflammatory about an unrelated part petition Board of Elections issue makes this more sensational than it really is. It's, you know, and by the way, that Mr. Hicks, I have no knowledge, and I don't know what knowledge Mr. Hicks has about some anticipated short order new felonies coming, but that unrelated charge, or that, well, this charge with falsification unrelated to 351720, there's some other issues Mr. Uible's facing. But as we stand right now, that is a Nolly case. That is a 2020 CRB 01270 out of the Claremont County Municipal Court. And the special prosecutor out of the AG's office that Nolly that case was Mr. Joel King. That was not an in-county prosecutor decision to Nolly that case. I think Mr. Hicks used a home cooked or something reference to that. That's inaccurate. This was already an AG that put that Nolly on in 2020 CRB 01270. And I really think that's peripheral to these hearings. The only notice that we have is 351720. So those aren't an issue for this committee, but I just wanted to comment on them since Mr. Hicks brought that up in a way to make it sound like he has some knowledge that Mr. Uible is going to be indicted tomorrow or something. I have no information that if that happens, it happens, but all I can tell you right now is that it's nollied as we stand here today. So what I think you have is an authorized act for Mr. Uible to use the sample ballot as an endorsed candidate, and he was reproducing and sending it an otherwise approved sample ballot. We're asking the committee to make a no finding.
Thank you, Mr. Moss. Are there any questions from the commission? Whoa, hold on. I am muted now. Yeah, come on. There we go. Are there any questions of the commission members, Mr. Moss?
Yeah, I have one. I'd like to know why in some of the material, or in the material we were provided, there was a copy of a letter from Mr. Greg Simpson, who was the chairman of the Republican Party in Claremont County. And he stated he filed a complaint that someone sent out cards with his name on it, which they did not send, which they, I guess they mean the Claremont Republican Party. Is that true?
Well, we got what I can speak to is I had 2 or 3 conversations with Mr. Simpson, as I recall, when this was all developing in, I can't remember whether it was February or March. But anyway, I had conversations with Mr. Simpson. I had more than 3 conversations with personnel from the sheriff's office as this was all ongoing about this matter, about who was responsible for these materials. And I more or less just kind of talked about what our role is, filing a complaint petition, the application 351720, and those kinds of issues. And if you would to read some of the materials, I think the sheriff's office, after I talked to them about our role and how we participate in the system, I believe in reading some of those materials, they reflected to Mr. Simpson wanted to file a complaint. It's appropriate to bring permission to do that. We never received a complaint from Mr. Simpson related to these circumstances. Like I said, although I talked to him on numerous occasions, subsequently we did receive this complaint from Mr. Hicks, which raised these issues. We received a response from Mr. Uible, which you were circulated. We also received that letter from Mr. Simpson. I presume he felt obligated, or he felt it necessary to submit that letter on behalf, I guess you'd say on behalf of Mr. Uible, because Mr. Uible was a candidate, an endorsed candidate for the Republican Party, and he explained the circumstances from his perspective as chairman of the Republican Party. As it was a part of our file, I circulated it to all of you for you to take however you wished to take it. So that's how we came into possession of that letter. That's how it was circulated to you, along with the complaint and the response in this case. I don't know that I've got a whole lot else I can add aside from that, but that's why you got those materials, and that's what came from. Mr. Chair, members, do you want to hear a comment from Mr. Hicks?
Sure.
Okay.
Can you hear me again? I didn't mute myself.
Yes.
So just in quick response to Mr. Moss, I guess you guys could continue this case and we could see what happens with other charges. But the fact that Mr. Uible was on probation was his motivation in trying to create pieces that appeared to be that he had support from other places. So by doing this with these cards, Mr. Moss already admitted it was Uible that paid for the cards, but the disclaimer said that the party did. Mr. Simpson's actually the one that filed the complaint with the sheriff's office, but in a way that was meant home cooking, that created a situation where they didn't think they would ever figure out who did it. When the sheriff's detective actually figured out who did it, then suddenly Mr. Simpson wouldn't file the affidavit that the sheriff's office asked him to, and came to me because I had been a witness in that with the sheriff's office to get me to file the affidavit that you guys received, because Mr. Simpson refused to do so to protect Uible after the fact. If there's any question relating to any of this, or if there's an option for you guys to just to continue it and see what happens with charges and other things, then I would recommend that you do that rather than make any decision now based on what I think is spurious information being provided by Mr. Moss as to what's actually gone on here.
May I comment?
Please, go ahead.
Well, first, the representation, the party bore the expense of the original creation of that sample ballot. That sample ballot was created after the endorsement meeting. Mr. Uible reproduced it at his own cost. He did not bear the original cost of creating that that political literature. That was a Claremont County Republican Party cost. What spurious comments I'm making, I would like to know, because I think that I'm accurate. You disagree? I mean, not my opportunity to cross-examine Mr. Hicks, but do you disagree that the party paid for the original production of that material? If I could direct a question, Mr. Hicks.
I don't think that's appropriate.
Okay, I apologize.
I think that we lost Ms. Tavares. I don't know if,
Yeah, but I think
I'm back.
oh, she's back.
Yeah.
I was trying to get on my computer. It didn't work.
Okay.
Let me just pose for thought a question. If Mr. Uible wasn't a candidate and he was John Smith in his living room, received some campaign literature, and he really likes that candidate, and at his own cost, he reproduces literature that says at the bottom, paid for by candidate, make up a name, candidate Smith, and he reproduces it